Welcome to Saving UX. I'm your host, Jeremy Kriegel. I believe UX is struggling. Look, there are more people doing the work than ever before, and every company says they are customer focused. So why does it feel so hard? And I don't mean the work. The work can be hard, that's okay. Why does it feel like we need to fight to do the things that will benefit the people we serve and the organizations we work with? I've been in this fight for more than 25 years, and I believe it's worth fighting for. UX, done well, and applied to important problems can change the world. Every week, I talk to UX veterans about the challenges facing our practice and what we can do to make it better. This week, I'm joined by Dan Makoski. Dan is a Chief Design Officer at Lloyds Banking Group. Before that, he was VP of Design at Walmart and Capital One, Head of Design at Google's Advanced Technology and Projects, and Global Head of Design at Research for Motorola. Dan, thank you so much for being here.
So excited to be a part of this conversation.
It's great to talk to you again. So, just to kick it off, where do you see UX now, and how has that changed, over the course of your career?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, well, first of all, I love the name of this focus. And you just can't help but think that, things suck. And this is sucks. I mean, back when I was at Microsoft, I was leading the Surface Interaction Design team. Our team's name was Sucks, Surface User Experience Team. And I think, the majority of my career as a designer has been practiced in unfriendly design territory. I went to Microsoft at a time in the early O's when design was an afterthought. There were no vice presidents of design at Microsoft at the time. And a lot of us that were going there were pioneers. And in many ways, it sucked as a designer to be there. I've spent most of my career in tech, and I now work at a 254-year-old British bank that is heavily regulated and doesn't quite get designed. So I guess it's interesting because it's hard for me to look at the state of the industry somewhat objectively because I've consciously placed myself in environments that suck for design and user experience because I feel like those are places where design can have more impact. But to your question, I would just say, first of all, I don't like the term user experience anyway. I mean, I love Don Norman. I love the history. I love how it all kind of started, but I just hate the U in user experience because it stands for user. And I just feel like, Tufte has talked about this and others have talked about it, that I just think a user is such a small label to describe human beings.
Yeah.
If because we just user puts us into a place where I just care about you when you're like connecting with my interface, or or sometimes we use words like consumer, right? And consumer defines a human being as someone who just consumes things that other people make, number one. And number two, it just narrows them to an economic transaction. So first of all, I'll just say that what I care about
Is
is the
there a
state of
term that you're
design.
using that you find more appropriate?
I mean, I just design, and I talk about people. So not users, not consumers, just talk about people. Or, for our corporate clients, we talk about clients, right? Or if we're talking about consumers, we talk about households. And often we talk about the CFO of the household. It's more, likely to be a woman than a man here in the UK and actually other places as well. So we just try to like be a little bit more human about the language because it just helps us get out of, I think, a navel gazing, tech centric design practice of, I'm a user experience, architect who, studied interaction design. And it's just like we have so many freaking definitions in this space. And I've just kind of gone maybe wide to design, right? Because design, unlike art, is about solving problems for people. It's an act of service, it's an act of humility. And so to me, when I think about the state of user experience, I kind of lump it with the wider state of design, if that's useful.
And do you feel like that wider state of design is still in that unfriendly space that you talked about from the earlier in
Yeah,
career?
it is. It is. Um, but it's interesting because you see lots of forces at play. Um, you do see the rise of design in a couple of areas, and there's these amazing bright spots that we see. Right. I mean, back in the day, it was Johnny Ive being a chief design officer reporting to a CEO of a turnaround company. And then, fast forward a couple decades, Johnny Ive leaves to do his own studio, and now you've got a couple of heads of design across hardware, software reporting into the coup, in Apple. We're like, damn it, we were there. Like now we're going back. Um, and then you see folks like Airbnb, right? Where you've got co-founders of Airbnb, both, have this design background, and Brian, went to RISD, and this design-driven CEO has a chief design officer also reporting to them. And when you think about what they're doing with experiences going beyond stays, I mean, you just see a design-driven ethos in how that organization thinks. And so there's these bright spots where design thinking has been a term that has helped over the last decade or so, when Tim Brown coined it and Change by Design, and the D School kind of started, targeting business executives who are trying to innovate, to use this thing called design thinking. It's, the conversation around design, the conversation around the human experience has started to creep into boardrooms, into the C-suite, I think, more and more. But on the other hand, I think you've got more, design and tech savvy product managers, and you've got a whole kind of new generation of folks in the tech space who feel like tools are so accessible and like, oh, I can kind of design. I mean, we used to have that as well back in the earlier days when we were hand coding HTML, but I think I've seen the conversation shift a little bit, and those that aren't trained in design more and more seem to be getting involved in the practice of design or user experience. And I think that that really does a disservice to advancing the state of the craft.
Yeah, two things definitely to dive in there. But you talked about being in the C-suite. Like, you're in the C-suite now. What's that like for you as a designer who came up in this in a hostile environment, and now you have the penultimate seat at the table?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The C-suite, it looks glorious from afar, and then you get into it and you realize actually it just fills your calendar with an extraordinary amount of executive meetings and committee meetings and governance and risk meetings. Well, at least in a bank, it does. And so I have to say, actually, there's a part of me that loves it. I I've grown very fond in the last 3 years of my design risk committee, because at first I was like, oh man, I do I really have to do those kind of meetings? I really just want to be in the studio. I want to do design critiques. I want to work with design leads and design directors, kind of shaping design strategy. And then I realized that risk committee and our governance meetings, that's the language of the bank. And I'm in a foreign country. And if I want to be successful here, if I want to like order lunch, ask someone where the bathroom is, or just even have a decent relationship, I need to learn the language. So, for example, we were trying to educate some of the stakeholders across the tech organization and product managers around the value of design. And that was useful. But then we realized that in having risk committee conversations, we said, there's a real risk that we're not serving the needs of households and businesses because their voice isn't heard in the place where software is being built. And we scored the risk, we elevated the risk, we communicated the risk. And all of a sudden now there's a new dialogue because we're speaking the bank language. So I guess I would just say the C-suite is a lot less glamorous than you might hope, and a really hard work. And for design leaders, they just have to be prepared to um, translate the impetus of design into a way that the business really understands. But it is awesome to be a peer to the CTO, chief data officer, these other business leaders, and represent design. But the last thing I'll say there, Jeremy, it's lonely. It's so lonely. I've been the most senior design leader in the organization I've been at for almost the last decade, and I long for mentorship. I long for um, letting someone else kind of fight the good fight, in a very left-brained organization that doesn't get user experience or design. Um, but the sacredness of that responsibility of creating space for more human, empathetic, creative, intuitive thinking at the more strategic levels keeps me up and keeps me going, even when I feel very lonely sometimes.
I mean, I don't have responsibilities at your scale, but I definitely relate to that. Even just being for a long time the most senior person in much smaller organizations, I agree. Just still long for like someone else to work with, to collaborate with, to help provide guidance. So I think that's probably something a lot of people will identify with. I'm curious, as you learn to speak the language of some of these other folks in the C-suite, have you seen them adopt some of yours? Have you seen some design concepts start to become more natural in these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, it's not as much as I would want, but it changes. It's changing a little bit. Like even maybe if I can, yeah, I know this is a podcast, so you're just listening to this thing, but I'll find this little video.
We can
Um,
post a link to it. So
yeah, cool, cool, cool. I'll send you a little screen grab of this guy. But the CTO particularly was really, really um, open and excited about design. And a lot of our conversations were about how do we harmonize the processes of agile, which most right engineering and technical organizations are moving to in software, with the creative and expansion double diamond like possibilities of design thinking or design processes, IBM designs loop or other things like that. Because agile, as awesome as it is in tight cycles of building and learning, it's not particularly great at allowing teams to step back for a second and just kind of think about, well, where are we heading? Are we even on the right path? Like, yeah, I can prioritize this item off my backlog with some collaborative score and whatever Jira Confluence, and you know, start building it. But what's this? What is this all for? What's the story we're telling? What is the human need this is about, right? And sometimes you need to kind of do not just a mini retro, but like I don't know, like a deeper reflection about, what are we doing and why are we doing it? So he at one point, when I joined, he was like, he took on his new CTO role. He's like, hey, let's take a picture to mark the moment. I said, only if we switch glasses. So he took on my frames and I took on his frames. And to me, it was like this beautiful little symbol of we need to look through each other's perspectives. And I need to see that designers don't always come across as these incredibly powerful practitioners who can amplify the business through connecting to people in more genuine, simple ways. Sometimes designers come across and user experience professionals come across as those crazy folks who are just whipping around post-it notes, distracting us from building stuff, taking more time, and and vice versa. I think we in user experience and design sometimes alienate engineers and engineering and forget that their participation and involvement in a deep and holistic design process is one of our most powerful um, ways of elevating design. So, in fact, as chief design officer at Lloyds Banking Group, I have direct responsibility for several hundred designers on the team, but I actually feel also a sense of responsibility for activating and elevating design muscles across the entire organization of 75,000 associates who need to be more empathetic and more creative and more connected to the human experience, because both of those things together is what will create better possibilities for user experience to grow, to save UX.
right, we succeed or fail together. No, none of the customers say, "Well, I heard the designs were great, but the product sucks." But hey, the designs were great. Hey,
Totally.
doesn't matter. Um, I'm really encouraged, and I love to hear how much support you're getting and how open that organization is. I'm wondering if there were things that you have looked for as you've moved through different organizations, or if you reflect back on different ones you went to that have
Mm,
helped you determine whether an org you were joining was going to be supportive and really
mm,
get behind your work, or whether it was like lip service and that you're going to hit a wall everywhere you go. 'Cause I think that I certainly it's been my experience
mm.
where some organizations are excited, they want you to join, they want you to build the practice, and then you get there like, yeah, but we really don't want to change, stay in your lane. But
Yeah.
you're really affecting some significant change. How do you look at different opportunities? How do you evaluate an organization to tell whether or not you're going to be able to be successful there?
Good question. Well, I think I kind of flip that question around now in my career, where it's less about is the organization really ready, and the question is more how much frustration am I able to take on? Like, let's be totally honest. If you're practicing user experience anywhere in the world, you're frustrated because user experience by definition was born out of the tech environment, which isn't about primarily about human factors and desirability. If you really want to focus on practicing design and user experience at like kind of the ultimate levels, I mean, you got to go to boutique design agencies that just really focus only on that. Most UX practitioners are in the bowels of corporate, you know, spaces that are about either technology or business or other factors of innovation. And then they're like, oh, this human factors of innovation, desirability. Yeah, okay, we'll think about that as a secondary thought. So first of all, I think we all have to be honest with ourselves. You are setting yourselves up practicing user experience for mental health challenges. You just are. Like, I am always constantly more ambitious and excited about the possibilities for design and user experience, and the organization is ready to adopt. It's by definition, the chief design officer at Lloyds Banking Group will constantly be frustrated, will constantly be impatient, will constantly be disappointed. And I went in knowing that. And I'm like, awesome. So I think the question is, how resilient are you? How much can you take? And if you are super resilient and if you can take a lot, and if you have internal intrinsic drive as a designer or user experience practitioner to really serve people, then go to the war torn areas of left brain leaning organizations that just couldn't care less about people. That's where you're needed. and and then go as far as you can, and not so far that you're broken, but go as far as you can, because I would just say that I get so much more satisfaction having progress at places like Lloyd's, Walmart. Even Walmart and design was kind of a bit of an oxymoron. Like, people don't think about Walmart as, oh, a design centered company. So that's the first thing. I would flip the question. The second thing I will say is, I think that I don't look for evidences of companies having practiced great user experience and design. I look for great thirst, great curiosity. And in that equation, how high is that curiosity? Like, I've had a couple of, I'm actually, I don't know if we want to announce on this live on this podcast, or, but I'm about to actually move to a new space. I'm taking on a
Oh, yeah.
chief design officer role for the Fortune 5, actually. Talk about that in a second. But as I was exploring my next step, there's some companies that I decided not to work for because the CEO didn't care.
Mm.
And for me, if the CEO doesn't care, there just isn't the executive cover to be able to create the conditions where design can flourish in the right way. Now, that CEO doesn't even know what design is really about. They don't really have to have hired a ton of designers. They don't have, haven't, but at least if they don't care at all, then I just feel like you're going to hit walls really early on.
I love what you just said about the conditions to flourish. So I'm
Mm.
curious, what do you see as the really core conditions for design to flourish? And as a leader who, at your level, you're not spending the time in the studio doing the crits. What do you do to
Mm.
encourage those positive conditions?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of them. If we think about design or design leadership as gardeners, thinking about soil and light and fertilizer and rain and water, all that. Um, well, let me just say, there's three things that are most important to me. I mean, the first one is not something I would have said early in my career, but it's a data-driven and outcome-driven environment in the business that design has embraced. Too often, I think user experience in design has tried to convince the business to accelerate based on the just saying how important design is, and showing case studies where when we do great design, like, look, amazing things can happen. And I think, honestly, I was talking to Phil Gilbert about this, who's head of design at IBM Design, which is arguably one of the world's largest design initiatives. I think is how they describe it. And I remember, actually, when Phil took on that role, I was so excited. IBM had essentially a chief design officer, and then I looked at Phil's LinkedIn history, and I was really pissed because it was like CTO, 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 head of design at IBM. I'm like, what the fuck, man? Like when we got these like couple of precious roles for design leadership at the executive level open up, you get people that like didn't study design, haven't like paid their dues. Like anyway, so I went, my first meeting with Phil was like, what the hell are you doing design? And I was like, oh, self-centered and egotistical. And then as I got to know Phil, I was like, oh my God, he's great. And I'm so glad design leadership has him. But he's really passionate about just being honest and truthful that the business doesn't care about design, actually. And your goal shouldn't be to get them to care about user experience or design. What the business cares about is what every business cares about, which is successfully innovating and doing cool stuff in the market and launching products that matter and all of that. And if you can connect design to being the most powerful force to advance the interests of the business, yes, in more human, social ways, et cetera, you will do well, right? So I think that's one of the conditions for design to flourish, is that for the design team to learn the language of the business and to talk about outcomes and to use data. Because if you get into battles about power, hierarchy, or charisma, design will always lose, right? And this whole idea of using how might we statements that come from design thinking and using, John Doerr's measure what matters, OKR like framework, like those are incredibly powerful for design. Like let's say for us, one of our, outcome driven approaches within one of our design teams here is, how do we help households in the UK save a bit more for emergencies? Right? There's not many households in the UK that have more than a couple weeks worth of savings reserves, and then they go into financial crisis, right? If there's emergencies that come up. And as designers, yes, we'll do design research and personas, and we'll iterate and we'll prototype, we'll do design thinking and design sprints and all these things, but we're just trying to get households to be safer financially. And anyone can have a great idea about how to do that. And then the question becomes, how do we know we're successful? Well, you need data and analytics to be able to kind of measure getting to that point. So that's a key condition. I think the other condition for design to flourish is you need a company culture that is ethical, because at the end of the day, design is about serving human beings. And more as we think about the global pandemic, we think about Black Lives Matter, we think about sustainability, climate crisis. We think about, design more and more has to figure out how human beings can live and collaborate and connect on this planet longer, not just how do I squeeze marginal revenue out of my next quarter for business profit, without thinking about the wider effects of human beings. And we've launched actually our ninth guild in design is the Societal Design Guild, which we expect every designer on our team to think about the societal implications when it comes to vulnerability and accessibility, inclusion, diversity, sustainability around every single interaction that we create and every product we make. And then I would say the third condition is just, in general, you need a growth and a learning mindset, right? You need tight cycles of iteration. And an agile conversation, it would be cycle times and lead times that are tight, right? When I joined Lloyd's, many of our teams were many months, sometimes several quarters of lead time and cycle time from the moment you have an idea to when you ship some software. And we got to a place where across tech and product and design, we all got to a place where we can get those in week time frames. And most, of course, Silicon Valley does that in terms of days. And if you don't learn fast, you will not do great design, because if your design ships 12 months from now, you're in that kind of political debate mode. It's too precious. You're not going to get it right the first time. You don't have a chance to learn. So anyway, I would say those are some of the key conditions.
That wraps up part one of my conversation with Dan Makoski, Chief Design Officer for Lloyds Banking Group. Tune in next week as we dive into ethics, how to create leadership roles, the future of C-level design, and much more. You can find the show notes as well as past episodes at sux.live. That's SUX for saving UX.live. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, such as the rest of this conversation with Dan Makoski. Until then, I'm Jeremy Kriegel, and this has been Saving UX.